and a big thanks to Peter Gallagher, who's got up in the middle of the night in Florida to do this masterclass. Peter and I are going to do a tag team. I'm coming at this from the academic perspective, and Peter coming at this from the industrial perspective. So what we wanted to do was give you a quick run through on the basics, really, for pitching to industry, how to try and get it right, and some of the major pitfalls that people tend to fall into. So, Peter, you're driving the slide. So next slide, please. So just really starting with the basics, and I'm going to cover three specific points here. The first one being the ask. Then the company entry point that you try and go in at, and then the company's interests and current product portfolio to make sure that that is aligned with what you're wanting to approach industry about. Next one, please. So we'll start with the ask. And I think there are several questions you should be asking yourself right up front. First, be very clear what it is that you're pitching. Is it a service or is it a potential product? Secondly, and really importantly, what do you see as the benefit to the company? As an academic, you will have spent an awful lot of time working on this particular item. You will see the benefits from your perspective, but what's really important to the company is how it's going to benefit them. And that's really important on your pitch up front. Thirdly, what is the estimated cost that you're really expecting this to cost, and do you expect the company to fund this completely, co-fund it, or jointly apply for funding with you? I think a lot of people tend to go to industry thinking they will fund everything, but in fact many companies would expect to be co-funding or applying for funding with you, and if you've got leverage that you're coming in with, it's far more attractive to the company than just a straight ask. And then finally, within the ask, you really need to be clear about what is the time frame and what are the obvious milestones, because industry will largely be driven by milestones, and you really need to know what are the stop-go milestones within that sort of process. Next slide, please. Second, and really importantly, what's your company entry point? I have seen way too many academics who tend to meet up with the sales personnel for many companies, who talk to the sales personnel, who manage to get a free sample, for example, of what the company is working on and products that it's got out there, do some work with that, and then believe that they've got an entry into that company. The sales personnel will not make decisions on research and development activities within that company, and you can spend an awful lot of time talking to them and potentially doing small amounts of work that get you no further ahead with where you want to be. So I think you need to think, have you worked with the company before? Who have you worked with in the company? Do you know others who've worked with that company, if you really don't have very strong links, who might be able to introduce you to the right people? And then are you talking to the right people in that company? And as part of that, you really need to understand the company structure and who the decision makers are for the level of ask you've got. Because asking a company for a £10,000 investment, the decision point in that company will usually be very different to asking a company for £500,000 investment. I'm going to pass in the tag team over to Peter now, just to say a little bit more in that area.
So good afternoon, everyone. So thanks, Janet. So I think Janet hits upon a really crucial thing. What are the entry points that you can have? And as she alluded to, you can go in through sales. You might know the CEO if it's a small company, president of a division. But generally, when you go in through all those sales points, at least in Unilever, and I would say it was particularly true of most big companies, FMCG like Unilever and Procter and L'Oreal, or big pharma, is you will be directed to R&D, almost certainly. And within R&D, there are sort of two channels that you can enter through. One is research, which is, as you would suspect, longer term, more speculative, 3 to 5 years out. Or you could go in through the development wing, which are sort of people who are focused on products within the next year, 2 years, 3 years, probably the longest time frame. And they would be the people that you would meet. Now, depending on the level you're coming in at, you would either meet a junior manager or it could be a VP of R&D. If you go into research or development, then it becomes a very binary process. Is there an idea that they want to take forward? If there is, great. If not, it will be killed pretty quickly, right? So you should have a fairly good idea within a week or two of having entered the idea, whether they're interested and whether they want to learn more. If it's in research, then they go through this sort of block that I've put here, and I'm not going to do this in any detail, but they ask the sort of basic questions one would expect. Is there an effect? Is the material safe? Do you have any prototypes? What is potential cost? And what is the IP? Right? They would be some of the questions that they would be asking or trying to develop answers to either alone or in conjunction with yourselves. If you go in through the development wing, it's basically you've got something that works. You've probably got a prototype, and they will then say, well, is it compatible with our formulation? Does it meet an unmet consumer need? How can we make this cost effective? Are the regulatory frameworks in place to allow this to go to market, so on and so forth? And they will start to go into a very detailed process that will enable this material or service or whatever you're providing to enter into the marketplace. And as I said, this list is not exhaustive by any means, but it should give you a good inkling of what's going to happen as soon as you get through the door and as soon as they say, yes, there's some interest. So, Janet, I think I'll hand it back to you for a second or two.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So the other thing you need to make sure of is that what you've got to offer really does align with the company's interests and its current portfolio. And I do stress that current portfolio because clearly all companies evolve over time. And again, I've seen people go because they've got something that is relevant to an old product or an old activity that the company's been working on. It's no longer active in that space and therefore not the right company to go with. So again, before you approach the companies, do you know what product the companies currently have? Do you understand the market that those products are going to go into? And do you know what other companies are doing that are working in that space? And then clearly, is there a clear understanding of the market need for the product or service that you're suggesting you want to put in so that it's actually got a pull from the market that is going to interest the company you're approaching? Next slide, please.
Okay, this is me again. So, as Janet sort of highlighted, you have to know the business in which you're entering the basics. And so, look, I put 3 very different businesses here. Top left-hand quadrant is personal care. Top right is basically home care and laundry. And bottom left is the paint industry. So I got all this information from the internet. So it's not proprietary information. You can just go and search for it, and it's packed full of information. So let me take you through a little bit of the detail. You can see top left, personal care is defined as hair care, skin cleansing, deodorant, skin care, oral care, makeup and perfume, right? It's a global business. That's what the little globe shows. The size of the business is appreciable, almost $750 billion. And the CAGR, that's the compound average growth rate. That's a measure of how fast that business is growing every year. So that size is quite attractive, right? It's growing faster than global GDP. So that means you're going into a business that is growing, and so they'll be looking for technology. The gross margin is medium to high, and that spread is everything from bar soap, which is, you know, a very utilitarian basic product which companies won't make a lot of money on, all the way up to high-end skincare that are tweaking the genes on your skin and making you look a bit younger, right? And that would, you could charge more for that. So that's a measure of profitability. So big attractive category, big growth rate, fairly good profitability. And then the reg stands for regulatory environment, and it varies across categories. Some of these products, toothpaste, for example, are considered as drugs, right? Now, in that one box, you've got a ton of information where you can start to say, where does my product sort of lie? On the right-hand side, it's very, very similar for a laundry category, a category I know a little bit about. But in the bottom left, I didn't know anything about the paint industry. Through my contacts, now I know a hell of a lot more. But I was able to pull across, was this a big market? Was it attractive? Is the gross margin attractive as well? And then what is the regulatory environment? And in this instance, the regulatory environment around volatile organic compounds, solvents and paints is quite high. So it's a bit of a tricky category, but then you know how to pitch certain technologies. And the bottom right-hand quadrant is, who are the competitive set? So in personal care, it's the usual suspects, Unilever, Procter, L'Oreal. Home care, it's very similar. And paint, there's only really two big players, Sherman Millions and Exxon Nobel. And then there's some very strong local players. So it tells the people that you're going in to talk to that you've done a little bit of homework, right? The next chart is really thinking about, where is this technology going to sell? Right now, this on the left-hand side, it's an old chart, but I think it tells a very true story today as it did back in 2020 when it was constructed. So these pyramids look at the world population in terms of billions, and in terms of how much money they have a lot, haves, that's probably middle class, and then the have-nots who are sort of the impoverished. And it shows what happened in a decade. And how those population segments changed. Now, why is that sort of important? Well, if you're going to be selling a drug compound that is only, is going to cost $500 a tablet, well, you have rarely or can only pitch it to that top pinnacle of the pyramid, rarely to the rich countries. If you can make that medicine more ubiquitous at lower cost and more available to the general population, then your volume goes up enormously. It goes from 1 billion to almost 3 billion, right? And why is that important? The more you produce, the lower your costs, the better your profitability, right? And so understanding the demographic of where you're going to be pitching to tells a company, do they have to mass produce this, or is it for a very specialized segment? And then on the right-hand side, I've shown how a Unilever would look at a market, and this would be true whether it was pharma, insecticides, laundry detergent, it would be very, very similar. And this is really how much of the population using per head. And in this case, it's around cleansing. So how much body wash and soap do people use? And you can see, I'm very pleased when I show this chart, usually to an American audience, that I can say that people in Britain spend far more on cleansing than the Americans do, right? But the real point of this chart is that if you could get everyone in China to spend as much as the people in the United Kingdom on cleansing in any 1 year, you've got a $50 billion market in China. So this is looking at the long-term attractiveness of this market as populations become richer.
So back to the basics again. A few things that you need to understand when you're pitching. One, clearly the IP position and what you can disclose and when you should disclose it. Really important because the company will want to know that. And if you also go in and start talking to them about material that should be under a non-disclosure agreement before you start talking to them, and you haven't got that in place, it's a huge red flag to that company right up front that says if you're going to do that with them, you will walk through the door and talk about things to other companies as well in that format. So they want to know, do you understand IP? Do you understand what you need to get in place before you start talking about these things? And what is the freedom to operate for the company if they talk to you about this? You also need to understand the stage that your proposition is at on the product development pathway. And almost inevitably, I find most academics overestimate how close they are to a final product when they go and talk to industry, because they don't understand the D bit of R&D. They understand the early R bit of it and believe that by the time you get to the end of the R process, you're there as a final product. Nothing could be further from the truth. As Peter's earlier slide shows you, there's usually 2 or 3 years of work to be done in the D bit of that space before a product ever gets to market. You need to understand, again, the market that your proposition is actually going to go into and what need it's fulfilling. And make sure that you align the way that you present what you're wanting to do with the company's interests and portfolio. And then understand the decision-making process in the company. So Peter's aligned that early stage of decision-making, but that usually will be across many meetings before you get an agreement on exactly what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and when you're going to do it. And again, I think until you've had experience of working through this process several times, a lot of people believe it's going to be far easier than it is to get those agreements across the line. And they often go in expecting too much as they go through that process right from the beginning. Next slide, please. So just a few remembers before I pass it over to Peter to go through far more detail from the industrial side. That you've got a great deal of time and effort invested in your ideas, but the company is going to look at this very, very differently. And unless you are prepared to help them understand what the value of your proposition is, then the chances of you getting good traction from the company are probably fairly limited. And a word of warning, don't mistake the natural tendency for individuals in companies to generally want to try and help when you go and talk to them about your research interests. We're all scientists at the end of the day, whether we're sitting in academia or in industry. And very often companies will try and be helpful, providing basic advice, providing product samples, things like that. But don't go away with the feeling that what you've got then is a full-blown industrial collaboration. There's a big gap between that and getting a full-scale industrial collaboration through the door and signed up by everybody. And over to Peter now.
Okay, thanks. So engaging with industry. So I constructed this sort of brief and got Janet's input around this. And there's really 3 things I'm going to try and address. And that is how to leverage, not facilitate, but how to leverage translational science from your laboratories into a sort of product in the market. And then around partnerships, how partnerships managed, how should they be developed? And what are the respective strategies for doing that? And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about culture and the differences between academia and industry, and why getting cultures of your partners, knowing who you align with, is just as important as knowing who you don't, because that really makes for a good working relationship, or it can break it. So what are my qualifications for talking about this? So I was an executive with Unilever, where I worked for 31 years before I retired a couple of years ago. This is a snapshot on the left-hand side of some of the brands I worked on, big global brands. Some of these companies were acquired, and by no means, I probably worked on hundreds of brands throughout my time. And I've basically got the expertise of taking new materials from a laboratory such as yours into a marketplace at big scale. And then at the bottom of this chart, you can see some of the academic institutes, which are also brands that I worked with, and you can see LSTM there. But you can also see Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Indian Institutes of Technology. And I know how these institutions approached innovation and what the governmental restrictions were on these organizations. Since I've retired, I set up my own little business, and what I show you on the right-hand side are those companies that I interact with. And at the top three, I've got a very tight formal program with some biotech companies here in the United States that I work with really closely. And then beneath that is a cadre of other companies who I work with or consult for certain institutions, mainly on a pro bono basis, really as a way of giving back. But this ratio of 3 to the many is quite important, and I'll touch upon that because you can only handle so many relationships at once if they're deep and if you're going to be taking things to market in quite a quick fashion. And I'll show my explanation for that throughout the presentation. So why do companies like Unilever need to be able to sort of collaborate? Well, this is a chart which I call science by the numbers, right? So the left-hand panel shows that there are almost 9 million scientists in the world, and the rate at which the number of scientists are growing in our scientific community is way beyond global GDP. So that's a good thing if you're a scientist. Secondly, there's two nations who are spending 2/3 of the money. It's China and the United States. You can see Europe is about 11%. But if you have a look at where the concentration is of scientists' money or publications, 90% of it is within the G20. Now, just to put another lens on that, is that if you have a look at where the distribution of the scientists are, then South Korea has more scientists per head of population. And you would expect this to follow GDP. You would expect America to be number one because it's number one in GDP, but actually it's not. It's Korea, and that's 12th on the global GDP list. And you can see I've highlighted Germany and United Kingdom here, which have about 50% less or 30% less scientists than South Korea. So why does Unilever need to collaborate? Well, we don't have a sort of dominated market on the scientists. We only have 5,000, and therefore you are forced to look outside to academia and to suppliers in order to get more technology into your sort of business. So there's a compelling case for collaboration. The second is what do governments want out of universities and what do industry want out of universities? So, of course, governments want you to teach the next generation. They want you to do high quality research. And they want you to do, thirdly, in the priority, these are priorities in list of order. They want you to do knowledge exchange with industry, right? And that sort of model doesn't really set up for fast transfer of science and technology into industry. Really what it sets up is high quality papers with low industrial output. What industry would like to see out of universities is knowledge exchange, right? And they would like, of course, you to teach the next generation and to do research. And I think if we could get that model going, there would be fewer high quality papers, but there would be high industrial output. So let me give you an example of that. When I visited the Chinese Academy of Sciences, they said, of course, Peter, we can work with Unilever, but the government says we have to do all the Chinese businesses first. It shows you how the focus is, and it's very, very similar. Not as bad, but it's very similar in India. And so that's the sort of competition we're working in globally. There are a few institutions, LSTM is sort of leading this, but the University of Liverpool and other institutions in the northwest of England who are trying to shift this model to be more industry friendly. But the organizational inertia can be quite high. And so the will needs to be there if you're going to collaborate with industry. It's not a nice to say, you have to do. Then what do universities provide and what do industry need? So number one, industry provides, big new science and technology. Industry needs some of that, but not as much as you would think. The second thing that sort of industry at universities and academia provide is high capabilities in order to drive solutions. And industry have lots of problems. which might be sort of not very academically interesting, but can change the life of a business, the life cycle of business, its profitability, or its go-to-market strategy. So industry has lots of problems that universities could help solve. That would be number one. Number two, in my experience and in the experience of people in Unilever, if it's not new science and technology with a really difficult problem set, generally academia are not that interested. So the organization is itself impervious to approach from industry in order to get help. And what industry is, it's quite a porous organization that if you have lots of solutions to their sorts of problems, you'll easily get traction. Third, and this is like a HR problem, leadership and building relationships is a real skill and competence. I think it's largely innate. It can, of course, be trained. But if you don't have the right relationship managers who are used to dealing with industry, its different cultures across different companies, and with the different players within those companies, you're going to have a hard time. So you should really look for the people who are good at this. And of course, you can train everyone, but you should look for the people who are really expert at it. So the example I've given here is Steve Jobs, right? Who was founded Apple, was fired from Apple, and then re-engaged by Apple, right? And he was re-engaged for his visionary and sort of views on technology going out into the future, right? And no one would question he was brilliant at that. But he couldn't work with many people. He was very, very difficult. So you would never let someone like him interact outside. You would download him and have relationship managers interact with the outside world. And that's indeed what Apple did. So getting the right sort of skills and competencies around this area, I think, is quite key. And then fourthly, there has to be open listening from academia and not closed down as it not being a very interesting problem and it being below my skill set to be able to solve that problem. It's got to be, look, how can we help? And then I think from industry's part, they don't make these problems interesting. They don't say what the scale of those can be and what the impact can be globally. Now, I think that if we can get this sort of mindset change, then you'll start to see way, way more funding going into universities. It will really improve the outflow of translational science. And it will really improve the relationship with partners. And once you get onto that sort of conveyor belt of being able to work with partners, those relationships tend to grow because they're seen as vital by industry. So how can you interact with industry? So I've got some reds, yellows, and greens here. So the purpose of academia is to educate the future generations, as I've said. And industry likes that because you supply the leaders who are going to help drive their company forward so that they can improve the well-being of consumers and shareholder value. Of course, you provide the next generation of leaders that allows the industry to be competitive. But there's a mindset within universities that industry have piles of money. And it may well be true for some industries. Pharma have tons of cash, for sure. But generally, when you look at an organization, and I don't know whether academic organizations are the same, but when you look at most industrial R&D groups, 80% of the cost is in people, right? That means 20% of the budget can go on projects. So it's not as much as people think, right? Now, industry are at fault for thinking that not only do academia have great people, but they consider them quite expensive, right? So there's a bit of a mismatch here in terms of budget, so that has to be straightened out. And then I've said this a couple of times that some of the problems really need simple solutions, and that's considered as being boring. And Janet brought up the thing around IP. You have to have a well-constructed IP principles going into any relationship of who's going to own what and why and how the royalties or the spoils will be shared. right? And then similarly for publishing, it's often the case that industry don't mind people publishing sections of work or bits of work. They can publish the whole work if there's IP around it, right? But that often takes a bit of a delay. So this has to be thought of very early in the relationship. And industry think, well, they just want our money and go off and do their work and then sort of publish, right? So that's got to be fixed. Both organizations think the respective partner is complicated. And when you get down to that level, it's no wonder some of these academic relationships can be a bit tough. And then the translation of stuff into the marketplace is not as high as you would think. Right. What actually happens when you start coming in with new science and technology? So I thought this would be a good chart to show you what the cost structure is like as you take a product to market, right? And why budgets are quite tight and why people have to be really disciplined in industry at screening things. So the top part of this chart, the funnel, was constructed by a academic out of the Harvard Business School called Kim Clark. And basically what he found, he went around, saw maybe 500 or 600 companies in all different sectors. And what he found was they had a very chaotic innovation process, but they all followed certain rules that he was able to streamline and then recommend a better way of working. And the better way of working was you have a ton of ideas. How many of them are going to market depends on what your strategy is, how much money you have, the competitors, so on and so forth. And then that killed a lot of the ideas. And so the ideas were screened and they went into this funnel and they go through this stage-gated process of hurdles that if you pass it, you move on to the next sort of hurdle. Unilever adopted this sort of model back in the 90s, and then it became the industry standard. And Unilever developed it for their business model, and other companies took it up with this stage-gated process. So what I show on the bottom bit of this chart is that if academia do a cost of science and technology, and it's 1 unit, then when it goes into this funnel, you can see as you go along, you start to get an increase in cost. And the big costs start to come on what's called the contract gate. And that's where you're buying molds, you're setting up factories globally, you're setting up your supply network and supply chain to be able to produce these materials. You're starting to present to your trade partners like Walmart or Tesco, and you're starting to invest. Then when you launch, wow, look at how much money you spend. It's 100 units, right? And that's basically around, you produced all this stuff, now you have to send it out into the market and you have to advertise behind it. So your 1 unit of investment ended up being 100 units cost or more to the likes of a Unilever. So it's quite expensive to take stuff to market, and that is per country. So if you're in 90 countries, just think of the cost. Then at the bottom of this chart, I've done what the relative costs are of doing external research to a company like Unilever. So this is a relative cost model. So India would be about 1 unit of cost. UK is in the middle at about 5, and US and China at about 8 to 10. US is by far the most expensive. China used to be very close to India, but when all the PhDs that qualified, Chinese PhDs, qualified in America at MIT and the likes, they all went back to China and thought they could charge way more. So that's why you saw this price escalation. So having given that sort of picture, what are the 7 steps that I think that academia can use, excuse me, to engage industry? Well, the first thing to realize is today's model just isn't working. There's not sufficient open listening, and industry doesn't pitch its problems well. The second is there has to be a realization that the balance of science and technology to simple problem solution is out of whack, right? So there has to be a recognition that industry want solutions to some, quite simple problems, really. And I don't know what the exact magnitude is, whether it's 10 to 1 science and technology to problems, but it could even be bigger than that, but certainly not less than that. The next step would be opening, listening, and engagement. You have to get the right academics, the right teams there, the right people with the capabilities and skill sets to be able to interact. And then industry really has to well articulate these sorts of problems in problem statements. Now, once you've got a problem statement with a program which is time bound with a statement of work, objectives, and goals, then money starts to flow because industry have to sort of help fund it, right? And then once you get through that, then I think intellectual property, as I alluded to a couple of times, is that if that is thought out at the very beginning, it's seldom a problem. If you wait till the end, it's a big problem, right? And so I think that needs to be thought through. Even if you have the IP in place, it's no problem. You should disclose how you're going to manage it with your industrial partner. And I think the bottom thing at the bottom of this chart is quite important, is that you have to move at industry speed, right? So for a new piece of science and technology, you're right, it could take several years, particularly if it was a drug active. But if it's a problem solution type thing, you can move quite quickly. And so industry won't wait months and months and months for you to get back to them. They'll just move on, right? So speed is quite of the essence. So look, I use this general format that we used with many industrial and academic partners, and I'll give you a couple of more sort of real life examples in a moment. But this is a framework that allows you to pitch what your technology is, or industry to pitch to you what their need is, right? So it should always start out with whatever the need is, top right-hand box. It must be an everyday simple language. So if you're talking about gene expression to someone who hasn't got a strong biological background, it isn't going to cut mustard, right? So the more simple and defined you can make the language, the easier it is. And there's various ways that you can screen these sorts of things or use visuals to bring it to life. So for example, I remember Janet showing us how she could track using some fancy engineering and cameras where mosquitoes would go. And you could explain the engineering and the optics forever, and people wouldn't get it, right? She showed one visual where people were covered with internet, and it was all around the mouth, the chest, and feet, right? Where the entry points where mosquitoes would go. That captured the imagination and sold the idea, right? So then, top right, what is the technology? What is the potential size of this? What is the cost and efficacy of it? So we can work out roughly on the back of an envelope what the profitability could be. And where the hell would you make it? These are all sorts of basic questions. On the bottom, I put demos that feed the need or feed the positioning, the product positioning are quite key. So this fancy chart on the right, where you see all the time points, is really how skin that is in good condition dries out versus skin that it's in bad condition, right? And scientists may well love this, but to put it in the shape of a leaf that's being covered with Vaseline and one that's being allowed to dry out without any Vaseline on it over the same time really sells the idea. And then what are the problems that need to be solved? No one expects it to be a fully fashioned product. And so there'll be problems around, do you have the right safety testing? Is the regulatory format in place? Is there stability issues? So on and so forth. But if you use this type of general format and keep it simple and don't pack it full of stuff, I think this will work as a standard framework. So here's, I've done a very simple example here. The need was around the disease burden on children. So 750,000 children die every year because of diarrheal disease and 1.1 million because of pneumonia, all which could be reduced by really good hygiene and hand washing, right? The technology was two natural materials, terpineol and thiamol, which gave fast germ kill, and I'll come back to why fast was important in a moment, but it was only really effective against gram negatives, right? And so we went to a microbiologist called Jim Collins out of MIT, and we collaborated with him, and he was working on silver to improve the efficacy of antibiotics that microbes have become resistant to. And we thought, what the hell, why not give it a try? Could silver, with these two natural ingredients, improve the efficacy? And the answer was yes. So we gave it in a simple demo. You look at the sort of bug tray with water versus a conventional active versus these two natural ingredients plus silver, plus a clock, right? The clock was 10 seconds. Why was 10 seconds important? Well, the World Health Organization said you need 30 seconds to wash your hands, and Reckitt Bencki's, our competitor, said you needed a minute. We actually measured how long children wash their hands for, and it was 10 seconds, right? So we showed that we had efficacy, broad spectrum, within 10 seconds. Now, of course, there were problems with this. Silver tarnishes, as you know, from your grandmother's silver. The sourcing of thiamol was problematic. And then there were regulatory issues that we solved on a country-by-country basis. So that is taking that simple format that I showed you before and bringing it to life. And then I hope I can show this video. So let's give it a whirl. I've not done this over Teams before, so let's try it. Okay, so why would a Unilever go to such lengths to produce this high quality video of an Indian relevant story around hygiene and a child getting past his 5th birthday? Well, I can show you as many charts and as many demos as I could ever make, right? But when we showed this video to the CEO of Dow and to the heads of certain academic partners we were working with, not only did we see them shed a tear, right? We recruited them to help. The point being here that an emotional argument sometimes wins out all the technical prowess that you can show. That was the point of this sort of video. And the rest is history. We had Dow and several other companies work with us, and we became very successful in this market. So, and then just to build on this one last time, it just shows that you can bring this to life with a brand. The technology was how do you improve a standard alcohol sanitizer? The solution was putting in vitamin B, natural, that elucidates the outflow of antimicrobial peptides. There's biology and demos that you can use to do that. And what we were able to show when we took it to market is that you got 10 hours protection because you were releasing AMPs onto the hand. And that might not be very important in the UK or Europe, but in Africa and India and China, where a lot of kids eat with the fingers, It's very important to reduce bacterial load. So going back to sort of problem solutions and statements, I've shown you that cost is prohibitively high if it was for a new piece of technology going to market. If it was something like a solution that you were bringing to industry, the cost of pushing that through is generally much lower, right? And the cost benefit to the university is sort of appreciable. You would get paid for that, right? And maybe get IP. That's the point of this chart. Then I'm almost at the end of the presentation, but this looks at what the sort of what the different type of projects are and how you can interact. And this chart is not mine. It comes from a person called Matt Reed, who's at the University of Liverpool's Materials Innovation Factory. But he developed this chart when he was working for me in Unilever, and he's now on secondment to the university. So the left-hand box says, what is the ambition level? Is it state-of-the-art technology or next generation? And what are the asset types that the institution have? Is it knowledge? So, soft, not real capital, it's more soft intellectual capital. Or is it capability in terms of kit and hardware and know-how? And so he built up one of the interaction models is a consultation or service or co-create or contract and discover, depending on this 4-box matrix. And probably the easiest point is if you're doing a service, right? It generates dollars for you, it's low cost for the industry, and it builds relationships, right? If you're consulting, then that's second base. You've got some specialization that you can help industry with, and you should get paid proportionately for that. If you're co-creating, and that's not just you've got a piece of IP, you will co-create IP. There will be a rising IP when you put smart people together. There will be stuff that comes out that you should both own. And then that would lead eventually to contract discover, where you've got a really strong built out program over multiple years. And they're the sorts of typologies in which you can interact. Now, I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation when I introduced my sort of background. How many relationships can you actually manage outside? So the top chart is the Dunbar chart. And Dunbar is I think he's an anthropologist out of Oxford University. And basically what he measured was the size of the prefrontal cortex of apes and monkeys, and saw how many strong grooming relationships they had within their sort of tribe, their sort of pod of people, primates they interacted with. And then he was able to measure the size of that prefrontal cortex and make a prediction about how many humans would make, as well as other primates. And what he came out with was 5. If in your lifetime you make really 5 relationships, then you're lucky, right? And you may think this is a bit bullshitish, but this is how Facebook build their interaction model. So there's a lot of background to this sort of work, and I strongly believe in it, right? So why is that important? In the work that I did with Unilever, we could only manage, of course, we were a big organization, we could manage lots of relationships, but I could only manage 5 intensely, right? And once you got out of that, they started to be dilutive and they fell frail. It's like in any human relationship. If you don't pay attention to it, you don't nurture it, you don't make sure the needs of the other party are taken care of, then it falls apart. So the impact of that for organizations, doesn't matter whether it's academia or industry, is that if you're managing 5 or 6 relationships really closely, that's probably optimal. If you've got you can associate with many groups, like I do, all the other industrial partners I interact with beyond the 3, and I can have really good relationships with them, but not as intense. If I had a big research team working for me, I could manage 100 or 200 relationships because you can disperse it across the group. And so I think you have to be careful how many relationships you manage, because it can end in disaster sometimes, and no one wants to see that. So culture matters. So the last two charts, I think, or the last three charts. This is the story of two big chemical companies. One on the left, a US chemical company, 3 letters beginning with D and ending in W. I'm sure will be no surprise who that is. And we set up a relationship with them. And we always had informal pre-dinners. We had open sessions. We had trial and error, full disclosure of data. We told them how to exploit these opportunities on the merits, and we got board members from both companies to participate. Hugely successful, by far the most successful relationship in Unilever history with an outside company. On the other side was a well-known chemical company with 4 letters starting in B, ending in F, based in Germany. I'm sure there'll be no surprises who that is. And we followed exactly the same model, and it was a disaster. And we tried it twice, and it was an unmitigated disaster. And they killed everything just on the business side. They were not prepared to sort of experiment and see how much further it could go, right? And resultingly, we didn't get board member participation. So I think if you're going to work effectively with industry, then it's very, very important that you're sort of open and you follow this sort of model that I did. But the thing about culture is, if the culture doesn't fit, it's best to walk away. Don't waste your time. So what did we learn, right? So industry needs broader academia and scientists outside its own company in order to be able to succeed. And this sort of model that we've developed works with like-minded businesses, but doesn't really work as well with academia as we would like. So there's an opportunity to engage differently, and I think I've showed you examples around that. You have to realize that just like every R&D organization, industry is not as flush with money as you would think. Maybe some are, like big oil and big pharma, but generally the other players are not as flush with cash as you think. You have to understand that relationships are hard to do, and it's a professional competence. And if you want to become good at it, you have to put some time, effort, and learning into it. And then really pitching an idea is really quite key. And as Janet said, you should know the background, the structure, and you should use that 4-box model of what the need is, what the technology is, what a demo is, and then what the issues are around it. And recognize that most relationships might start with a service culture, but once you move around that 4-box model that Matt Reed did, I think relationships generally get stronger.